So with us this afternoon is Garrett Richards, and he's going to talk to us about when remote learning increases student connection, an iconic lessons from a grad program. And I'll pass it over to you, Garrett.
Great, thanks very much, Dav. Happy to be here. So as Dav said, my name is Garrett Richards. I'm an assistant professor with the Environmental Policy Institute at Grenfell Campus. I've been a part of the MUN community for just about 3 years now, so I'm still feeling pretty new to the university and to the province. I'm originally from Saskatoon. Besides being an assistant professor with the Environmental Policy Institute, I'm also the graduate officer for the new PhD program at Grenfell in transdisciplinary sustainability. That's not what this presentation is about, but if anybody has questions about that, I'm always happy to connect with folks about that new program. So what I'm talking about today is when remote learning increases student connection. Ironic lessons from a graduate program. And I gave my presentation a little bit of a provocative title there. I think it'd be a pretty big claim for me to say that students are better connected during this year than they are during previous years. But basically what I want to get across is that there are some ways that we've innovated as a program and as an institute to respond to students in ways that I think do allow them in some context to connect in ways that they wouldn't have connected in a standard year. And hopefully what we'll be able to do is take some of what we've learned from that, share it with other people, and also use it ourselves as we move back to a normal mode of program delivery and be able to keep some of that, some of the lessons that we've learned and ways of increasing connection between students. So what I have in the picture here on the left is a picture of our main classroom. This is in the Forest Center building at Grenfell Campus. This is sort of the EPI classroom. It's kind of a graduate classroom. They do a lot of graduate events and classes in that room. You can see we have a whiteboard wall. That's quite new as of the calendar year before this one. So you'll see that in my classes when they were in person, I did a lot of whiteboarding exercises with the students. And so get them into groups, get them to brainstorm on the whiteboard, everyone can see what's there. I really like using that tool. So when the pandemic started and we moved to remote learning, I found that I was really, really keen on using the whiteboard tool in the Bongo platform in Brightspace. So what I have on the right here, I don't have a picture of the students who were there and that sort of thing, because I don't usually take pictures of the class in that sort of context, but I do take pictures or screenshots of what we have on the whiteboard, and you can see that we were doing, it's something I call a brain stretch. I was sort of introducing them to the topic for the day and just getting them to sort of exercise their brainstorming muscles. So on one side of the slide, they were supposed to type things they could think of that are shaped like a circle but bigger than a car. And on the other side, they were supposed to type things shaped like a circle but smaller than a grape. So it was just a way to get them to stretch their brains and introduce them to a discussion we were going to have that day about the different scales of government and how you can ask questions at different scales and be thinking about sort of the different sizes and scopes of things from a political context. So it wasn't a totally arbitrary exercise, but it's one of these sorts of things that I like to do to engage the students and sort of help them to ease into the rapport of the class and that sort of thing. So anyways, those are the pictures that I have up there. I just wanted to sort of give you a really good idea of how I approach teaching in person and also how I approach teaching in an online environment. So I've given you an idea of sort of what my thesis is for today's presentation, what I'm going to try to get across. But sorry, I see the space bar makes me mute myself. I thought it would advance the slide. Let me figure, there we go. Okay, I think I just had to know what the active window was. So in terms of an outline for today's talk, first I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the Environmental Policy Institute and our graduate program, which is the Master of Arts in Environmental Policy program, or MAEP program. Then the body of my talk, most of what I'll be speaking to, is the student feedback mechanisms that we implemented before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and some of the outcomes that came from those mechanisms. And then also at the end, discuss some overall lessons that emerged from that, maybe things that are applicable to other programs or other contexts. So let me give you a bit of an introduction to the Environmental Policy Institute. This is a picture of my 6001 class. The second year that I taught it, we had a partnership with the City of Corner Brook through a City Studio program where the students worked on actual policy issues that were facing the city and they drafted policy documents. One of the groups actually presented their document to City Council and got it approved. So this was a picture of the night that we were able to attend the council meeting and do that. So you can see there's some city staff there, some councillors, the mayor, I'm there, and mostly it's a picture of students because a lot of what we do at the Environmental Policy Institute is implement our graduate program. That's one of the main things that we do. So the Environmental Policy Institute has been around since 2011. At Grenfell Campus, and the graduate program associated with it, the Master of Arts in Environmental Policy program, was Grenfell's first graduate program. Grenfell now has, it's almost about to have 5 or 6, maybe more than that. There's quite a few, but obviously it was an interesting experience for the Institute to be a pioneer in the sort of graduate level of teaching at Grenfell. And if you're really interested to read more, you can find the website there. So like many programs and academic institutions, EPI has sort of a 3-pronged approach to what it does, research, teaching, and engagement or service. And I want to focus mostly on teaching today, of course, but just to give you an idea more broadly of what EPI does. In terms of research, there are 4 core faculty members whose primary affiliation is with EPI. And then there are more than 10 affiliate faculty members. So faculty members that have their primary affiliation with a different department at Grenfell, but who supervise students in the graduate program. So quite a few affiliates, but still just 4 core faculty members delivering most of the programming. In terms of the teaching, we have our Environmental Policy Master's Program. Students can do a 1-year research paper option or a 2-year thesis option. And either way, they have to do 4 core courses. The number of electives is different depending on the program. The research paper students actually have to do 2, whereas the thesis students just do 1. And there's also an internship. So in the first summer of the program, or it would actually be the 3rd semester of the program, if you were in a 1-year stream, your final semester in the program, there's an internship. So it's really quite an intense program. And it struck me as intense when I arrived here. And there's ongoing review in terms of thinking about whether that's really what we want to be. But for the moment, the reality is that it's a pretty intense program. And what that means is that it's important to engage with students and figure out ways to support them. The cohort size is about 15 each year. The picture that you're seeing there, actually that cohort was a little bit larger than normal, but usually it's around 15 students. And then we also have some engagement and service activities. So for example, we'll put on collaborative events. Before the last federal election, we put on an event with the Western Environment Center. It was one of these 100 debates on the environment where we invited the local candidates for MP in this district to debate about the environment, and EPI and the Western Environment Center were co-hosts. We also have an initiative I coordinate called EPI Lab, and that stands for Environmental Policy Innovation Lab. And essentially that's a place where we can get together with various external partners. And the main thing EPI Lab does is it pairs students with those external partners to do work on projects that the partner needs. So it's about doing community engaged, sort of rapid response, short-term research that gives the students experience in kind of a real world research setting and also benefits the partners. So that's a fairly new initiative, but in my mind, it's one of the most important engagement things that EPI does. So that's a very broad introduction. Let's talk more about the MAEP program, the teaching that EPI does. So what I'm going to show you here is a MAEP feedback map, sort of a table here to flesh out the different ways that we typically have tried to engage with students to solicit feedback, and then some of the outcomes that have come from that. So I've just left this blank here for a moment because I just want you to get used to the structure. But what I'm going to be showing you in this slide is our pre-pandemic feedback mechanisms and outcomes. So I'm going to click and then the table is going to be filled with the content. So I have on one row here things that are happening at the course level, whether the feedback mechanism is at the course level or the outcomes are at the course level. And I need to clarify here that even though I'm sort of doing this presentation, speaking about the program as a whole, a lot of the course specific stuff is really just me. So I need to be careful and make sure that I'm not claiming that sort of every instructor in the program does things in the exact same way. When I'm talking about individual courses, I may just be referring to my own approach. And then we have program level mechanisms and outcomes in the second row. So of course, as you might expect, at the course level, we use the standard course evaluation questionnaires. And also, this is something that I do, but I also know that other instructors do as well, seeking feedback informally at the midway point of a course to see if there's anything that you can adjust for the second half of the course. So some of the outcomes that have come from those, my first year that I taught the research methods course in our program, I found my CEQ results to be fairly negative, but it was a really good learning experience, and students gave excellent feedback on how I could make things a better fit and better pursue the skills that students needed to learn. So I revamped the assignment structure for the second year. I remember there was a week at the end of August that I spent almost a whole week doing course development stuff, just thinking through how I could change the course to be more responsive and appropriate to what students really needed to learn. And that allowed me to come up with the implementation of something I call mini assignments, which are done on Brightspace. So they're typically weekly assignments, and it'll ask the students to practice one small skill. So some of the early ones are practice citations, and then they actually post their assignments for everyone to see, and there's sort of a peer-to-peer learning where they just practice that one small skill at a time. Instead of doing a full paper to practice citations, they just do it in that small sense. So I found that allowed me to cut out a lot of the bigger assignments that I had been giving to students that I was hoping would meet some of the same objectives. And I cut out a lot of the required readings as well, because I found that students weren't doing the readings if they didn't see the value in the reading. But the mini assignments are something I can monitor and something that students tend to see more value in. Also, one response that students gave me, I know it was tongue-in-cheek at the time, but during one of the midway feedback exercises, they said, oh, we want cookies during class. So I said, well, okay, that's easy enough. It's a small cohort. So that's what I started to do. That was something, of course, we had to discontinue once things went to a remote learning environment, but I had a shelf in my office that was stacked with cookies, and I would typically bring a box to each class and to each session of the EPI lab. These are graduate courses, so there's only one class a week per course, so it's not like it was that many cookies. But I found that it was a really good way to establish rapport and show students that I would respond to their suggestions as long as they were reasonable. At the program level, a few things we were doing before the pandemic was we have a student rep on the program committee. So that's, of course, common across different programs on the campuses. And we also did something I call a program review analysis. And I added the analysis part there because the program review was actually initiated by students. Students a few years ago sort of got together and said, we need to give our feedback on the program to the people who are running the program. And they sort of wrote up a report and surveyed some responses from other students, and they gave that to the EPI faculty. That was before I was here. And then the first year that I was here, the Graduate Student Society as a whole at Grenfell did this sort of program review for both the MAEP program and also the Boreal Ecosystems and Agricultural Sciences program. So they initiated that. They put together, they sort of had focus groups, they got students to submit their feedback, and then they gave that to EPI. So I'm not going to claim that the program review itself was something that EPI did. We didn't do that. It was student initiated. But we did do an analysis of that. We took all of the suggestions that we could find there, sort of broke them down into categories. We did sort of a prioritization exercise among the faculty to decide which things we wanted to act on. And we created sort of a skeleton for a plan that we could use to improve parts of the program. So there was a very measured focus on the analysis of the program review and implementation of it that was EPI initiated. So some of the outcomes from having the student rep on the program committee this is sort of ongoing feedback, so it's a little bit difficult to identify specific things. And I'd say that more of the things I've listed in that bottom right cell are from the program review analysis. But we did a survey of alumni shortly after we had done the program review so that we would have data on where our alumni had gone, what sorts of careers they had gone into, and how to contact them in case they were interested to speak to our current students. So that was an interest expressed in the program review and we acted on that and got some really valuable information. And we've even been able to further use that information to bring in alums to speak to the students in certain sessions and that kind of thing. I started a bi-weekly session called Policy 101, where I would go over some basic sort of political science and government structure stuff, because actually very few students that end up in our program have a political science background, but some of the things that we teach, it's really beneficial to have that background. So Policy 101 was something that we created to try to allow those students to still get an introduction that they wouldn't have if they weren't a political science student. So that was the response. The graduate assistantships that students do as part of their funding package, originally, so several years ago, students would do all of their assistantships with their supervisor. So they would typically do one a term, they were all with their supervisor. But students said they want variety in their assistantships. They want to do different things and work with different people. So Grenfell as a whole, and there's some EPI operational funding tied into this, changed the way that it assigns the graduate assistantships to the graduate students who are getting that funding. So now it's a lot easier for students to rotate between different supervisors, and that gives them a much richer experience. EPI Lab didn't really exist my first year. So part of the reason that I wanted to be involved in coordinating and launching it for my second year was in response to student feedback, because students wanted to know, what does it mean to be a part of EPI? They knew what the MAEP program was, like they know what a program is, they know what the courses are and that sort of thing. But what's the difference between the MAEP program and EPI as an institute? Why isn't it called an EPI degree, or how is it different than any other departmental program? So to make that clear, we really had to get students more involved with some of the engagement and research that we were doing, not just have them be involved in the teaching pillar of what we did. So EPI Lab was an opportunity to do that. They can do EPI research through EPI Lab and work with partners at EPI. So it was a way to sort of create a communal identity for some of the students and give them a sense of what it means to be a part of EPI. And finally, the last example that I want to give is some changes I made for the other course I teach. So I talked about teaching a methods course, and then you saw that picture from before. That's from my sort of practical applied course that I teach in the winter. And for that course in my first year, I ran it the way it had been run before. And it relies really heavily on contacts in St. John's. So there are coaches from the provincial government that help the students work through projects. And then we actually take a field trip to St. John's. We sort of tour the legislature building. They do a policy competition in St. John's with people in St. John's. And at the end of that year, some of the students said, why is this program in Corner Brook? Why isn't it in St. John's? And I said, that is a really interesting question. Let's make sure that we use some of the resources that are available to us in Corner Brook. So I added the city partnership to that course, which didn't exist before. And we started to recruit and rely and collaborate with provincial government workers who are here in Corner Brook, which there are plenty of. So that made a big difference to that course as well. All of this came out of feedback. So to me, feedback is really important. And these are some of the things that EPI has done in normal times, standard times, pre-pandemic. The next couple of slides, I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but they're just examples of the feedback mechanism, so I can give you a rich idea of the things we were collecting. So here's a small screenshot from the CEQ that I got from my very first attempt teaching in this position and teaching at the graduate level. And you can see, just like I said before, I changed the emphasis of the course in the second year to focus on building these small skills and mini assignments, because a lot of the feedback I got, as you can see from this example, in my first year was there were too many assignments. They were too early and they were too big. There was just too much. And they didn't always see the purpose of those assignments, right? You can also see there's a little bit of confusion being reported here, not knowing what the assignments were getting at and that sort of thing. So that feedback was extremely helpful. And I am really pleased with the course development that I've done for that course. And I don't have the quantitative stuff here, but the difference in my average CEQ score between my first year and my second year is enormous. So that really worked out, and I really thank the students for providing that thoughtful feedback to allow me to do that. I really wanted to show you a picture of the midway feedback that I would typically do in person that I would use the whiteboard for. This is the closest thing I could find. I must have sent all of my pictures on my phone off into a cloud or something that I don't know where they are. And I couldn't find a picture from that long ago, but I always take a picture of the whiteboard after I do the feedback exercise. Typically I'll do a start, stop, continue, if you know what that is. So there's a spot where it says things that the students want you to start doing, things they want you to stop doing, and things they want you to keep doing. So I would set it up that way, leave the classroom, let them fill it out, and then I would come back and take a picture and erase it. So this is the closest I could find. It's just another activity I was doing with students about halfway through the methods course in my second year, where I was asking them, let's summarize any concerns that you have about methods and methodology now that we're done that unit of the course. Because the second half of the course, or I guess the final third of the course, is more about writing up research and things like results and discussion and conclusion. So you can just get a sense of how I use the whiteboard for that sort of thing, and take pictures used for my own benefit. But I don't have a picture of the actual feedback activity, unfortunately. And here's a selection from the program review analysis that we were doing. I just did a really quick one because I didn't want to give you everything because it would have been really tiny. And I also didn't necessarily know if I should be sharing absolutely everything that's on our program review. So what you can see here on the bottom there is the top most prioritized possible actions that the program could take. And we sort of did that prioritization exercise that I explained to you earlier. So you can see things like setting program level outcomes was something that we wanted to do. We actually still haven't done that, interestingly enough. That's the other funny thing about the pandemic, is it does distract us from things that we are planning to do. But you can see that there's some really interesting suggestions that came from students. We sort of lumped those together into categories, and then we did a prioritization exercise. But you can see there that one, number 9, the one that's bolded there, offer extracurricular support sessions. So we did respond to that, making sure that we had a sort of the policy 101 sessions implemented the following year. So that's all general EPI feedback stuff in normal times. Now what I want to talk about is how that applies during the pandemic. So I chose a different shade for this table. I chose purple because it's kind of like poison and disease. I don't know. It'll help you remember. This is the sort of thing I do with my students, by the way. You'll get a good sense of that. So the feedback map for during the pandemic. And so a lot of the things that we would do would be the same, but there are some things that we couldn't do in the same way, or additional things that we needed to add. So at the course level, for example, of course, it's easy enough to continue to do the qualitative midway exercise. We're halfway through a course. You ask for feedback, but as you know, CEQs were discontinued the winter term of 2020. So it'll be 3 terms now that CEQs have not been implemented. And I'll reflect a little bit more on this later. And I totally understand the reason for that. I think that's a decision that makes a lot of sense. But as a new faculty member, in some ways, this is a disadvantage for me, because it means that I'm not automatically getting that feedback that I feel like I need to develop my courses. So in most cases, I've been implementing my own feedback forms at the end of classes. I take the same qualitative questions from the CEQ, I put them into a Google form, and I ask students to fill that out. It's a little bit different, of course, because I can't embargo the responses like the CEQ does. So I always tell students, if you're not comfortable with the idea that I might read something you've written before I give you back your grade, then you don't have to fill it out. Or you can wait until after and fill it out. Because that's the other thing. If you're not doing it through CEQ, students can fill it out at any time. They don't have to fill it out in the CEQ period. So they can wait until they have everything back and all the grades are finalized, and then they can give you the feedback. So some of the outcomes that came from that, and just making sure to maintain some of these feedback mechanisms during the pandemic, were some really excellent suggestions. So at the course level, one suggestion was that we shouldn't schedule assignments to be worked on during breaks. So don't schedule something to be due the Monday after reading week in the fall or in the winter. And I know that in the fall term, I hadn't even thought about that. I was like, oh, reading week is a time for you to do reading and to do work. But students said, well, during the pandemic, we think it's really important that those breaks be breaks. And I said, that is a really good point. So let's make sure that we coordinate and try not to put our deadlines immediately after the breaks in the winter term. And we did do that. And I think that was effective. We were able to change around the courses without too much trouble. And I hope the students were able to take more of a break because of that. Also in my 6001 class, I don't know if you got the sense of this already, but it's the applied class. Students do a lot of group work in that class. They work in groups, and many students were really, really hesitant about the group work in a remote setting. So by doing the midway feedback with them halfway through the course, I was able to get some suggestions that helped me for the project that they would do after the break. And they said, we'd really like you to check in with each group about halfway through the project to see how things are going and see if you can answer any questions and address any issues with group dynamics and that sort of thing. So I did implement that in the second half, and I thought that was pretty effective. It's still a really interesting and outstanding question, how to facilitate group work at the graduate level, and especially during a remote environment. I'm not going to claim that I've figured it out. I haven't. There's a lot of questions in the air, but having the feedback mechanisms there and available was really important for me to be able to sort of take the temperature of how students were feeling and get their suggestions for how to make things easier for the next half or the next bit of the class. At the program level, there were quite a few things we did that were new. So we still had the student rep, of course. During the summer for the pandemic, when it was new, and I know it affects everybody differently, but my impression was that things were a lot scarier and more sudden when it was first hitting and when we first moved to remote learning. So a lot of the students are sort of now they're stuck in residence or in another place, or they've gone back home so they don't have the same connection. We found it was really important to check in weekly with those students. So we had those weekly sessions, and it would always be, here's an open question, what can we do to help you during the pandemic? And that was really helpful for some of the internship requirements that were being met during that summer. So we had to do things differently for the internships anyways. A lot of the usual placements that we would have had to be canceled. So we needed to sort of come up with this alternative structure for some of the students where they would do some professional development workshops, and then they would do an unpaid, unfortunately, placement with an EPI lab partner, actually. So checking in with those students to see how things were going and see if we needed to clarify something with a host or get some other information to students. That was really critical for maintaining that connection right at the beginning when people were feeling really disconnected. In the fall, we also did a student needs survey. I'm realizing that the phrasing I used there actually makes it sound a little bit more innovative and a little nicer than it actually was. What we were looking for was students' extracurricular needs. So outside of the classes, what do they feel like they need to learn from the program? So it wasn't sort of a check-in, do you need help with anything? We did that informally, but in this more formal survey, we were asking, what is it that you feel like you need to learn about outside of class? And how can we make that happen as a program? So we did that and ended up with something we call the EPI roundtable, which took a little bit of time to get going, but it's essentially what the Policy 101 sessions have turned into. And now it's a catch-all space for whatever we feel our students are going to need at the time. So usually bi-weekly meetings. And this semester we did sort of a methods review where I went over the methods that I covered in 6002, especially for the second year students that hadn't been in that class for a while. We had an alum come and talk to the students about her career and some of the environmental policies and regulations she deals with at the federal level. And we also had a session about the internships to clarify some things before this summer's internships. So having that as a catch-all space, I think, is a really nice way to respond to that student input and student feedback. And it sort of gives us that space to be agile and flexible in how we react to what students need. So that's worked out pretty well. I'm realizing that I missed a point up there, that thing about platform guidance. So one thing the student rep kept telling us during the pandemic was that students don't know where to go. There's lots of platforms that they could meet on. They could meet on Teams, they could meet on Facebook, they can meet on Discord. I think there's another one that I'm forgetting about. But there's so many platforms available that they don't know where to go. So we had to do a little bit of talking to the Graduate Student Society and the Office of Graduate Studies here. And we did a little bit of asking around and trying to see what should be the default place for students to meet. And the answer from the Graduate Student Society was it should be Discord. So go to the Discord server. And we did communicate that to students. I don't know how often students use that, but I do think it was important to try to decide what the default platform should be. Some other things that happened related to that, though, is that students said they needed opportunities to connect, and they gave a lot of feedback about that in the fall term. So in the winter term, I started doing this thing where at the end of class, I wouldn't end the meeting, I would just leave the meeting. so that students could continue to talk to each other in that space. Of course, I would stop the recording. But normally they're able to do that in an in-person classroom. Of course, they can just hang around and talk to each other, but they can't do that in a virtual session unless you make that happen. So I thought that was a great suggestion, and I was really happy with how easy that was and how I just really got the sense that students were using that time. So I was really happy about that as well. And it was part of the student reps ongoing input that led to that sort of thing. And related to the student needs survey was a town hall discussion. So we did this at the end of the fall term to check in with everybody and see what they needed from the MAEP program. That's part of what led to the roundtable sessions, but it also was part of what led to what I call the virtual lobby, the hanging around after class in the virtual space. And for me, it was also really important because students were able to communicate in that context that they were really well, some of them were really worried about the group work that they would have to do in my winter term class. So again, not to suggest that all the group work was a major success in the winter term class, but I was able to do some things proactively that I wouldn't have been able to do if we didn't check with students at the program level, because students can't give you feedback about a course that they're not in before they're in it, unless you do something like this. So I was able to set up the teams in a way that I wouldn't have done in person. So I set up a virtual space for each team on MS Teams, and I know they used those spaces. And I made sure that each team had a group work contract, which is something that I've recommended in the past, but haven't necessarily expected or mandated. So I changed my approach there. And again, not to suggest that working in a group remotely is easy or something like that, but I think having that feedback and acting on it made it easier for students than it otherwise would have been. So lots of responses to student feedback during the pandemic, and lots of things that I think are success stories. Obviously, there's room for improvement in a lot of these areas, but I was really happy with how a lot of these things shook out. So I'm going to show you a few examples of some of these feedback mechanisms, just like I did with the pre-pandemic ones. Here's a screenshot of a start, stop, continue, midway feedback exercise that I did for my winter term course. So this one's pretty recent. This is only a couple of months ago. But there are some really good suggestions in here. You can see, I have no idea if you can see my mouse, but if you look to the top left, someone suggested maybe a mid check-in for the group projects to help alleviate conflict earlier. So I did do that, and I think that was a great suggestion. Also some suggestions about scheduling, because the way I do that class, because there's a lot of group work, on some of the weeks, I don't have a lot of material. We just meet briefly, and then I say, use this time for group work. And the students say, hey, we're in different time zones. When you do that, instead of starting at the same time and ending early, can you start later? And that was a really easy fix to make, and it worked better for me too, because then I didn't necessarily have to rush to have everything planned for 10 in the morning, but we could start at 11:30 or noon if we needed to, because the course ran from 10 to 1. So just really excellent suggestions from students, and some that are so easy to implement and have really notable benefits. So they sort of really punch above their weight in terms of that cost benefit trade-off. This is a screenshot of some of the responses given to the Google form, sort of informal CEQ that I conducted myself. So this is for my fall term course. That's a research methods one. You could see that there's quite a bit about the timing of assignments, and that was where we got the suggestion about the Thanksgiving break and having to do assignments right then. And so we were able to change things for the winter semester. I often get feedback that I take too long to mark, and I can't say that I particularly responded to that in any meaningful way for the second term, but it's always helpful to get that feedback. I think for me, it's important to know what students are feeling and what they're going through during the pandemic. Like it's more important than ever to make sure that we're doing these feedback mechanisms, rather than being something that we can sort of, oh, we don't have time for that, you push that aside. I think we should be doubling down on our focus for feedback mechanisms. You can see there's lots of good suggestions in the responses that I was getting. And here is a summary that a student assistant put together for me on the student needs survey that we did. So you can see suggestions for topics to be covered in an extracurricular sense. There's reviews of research methods, careers in environmental policy, talking with people working in the field. And so we tried to respond to a lot of these. In the summer check-ins that I mentioned, we did a lot of talking about working from home strategies and like how to stick to a schedule to maintain work habits and that sort of thing. And then for the EPI roundtable, we tried to identify the most needed or most interested suggestions that had come from students, and those were the ones that we tried to put into the sessions first. So just a glimpse there. So what I want to end with is a brief discussion of emerging lessons. So there's lots of data, basically, or results that I talked about, things that we did and things that happened because of those feedback mechanisms. And I think a lot of that was really helpful. But I want to try to make this sort of a more cohesive conclusion that you can take away. So I was getting at this a little bit earlier when I was looking at the Google form, but I think it's important to embrace feedback during crisis. So don't deprioritize it. I think that would be our default sense is, oh, we don't have time to do feedback right now. We're just barely getting by. Let's make sure that we just get our courses delivered and we won't necessarily worry about feedback. I don't want to assume, but I think that could be the default response for many instructors and many programs. And it's quite easy to fall into that given that the CEQ is not being run at this time. And again, very good reasons for that, because probably the feedback that we get during this time is not representative of our true abilities as teachers. So maybe that shouldn't go into somebody's P&T file, but it does mean that we're not getting the feedback if we don't ask for it. So what I find is that because we were asking for feedback, even though that took a little bit of time, it was more than worth it to spend that time to get that feedback and be able to act on it. Because a lot of what we were able to do was really easy and had some really great benefits. So I like to say that it was actually synergistic with other things that we're doing rather than something that competes for priority. I also think there's an interesting lesson here about innovation from crisis. So we were able to respond to some things in the short term. So some of the success stories that I mentioned were things like the virtual lobby, EPI Lab. Oh, I didn't mention this. I remember I put a little note on the slide earlier to talk about EPI Lab attendance. But one thing I noticed during the remote sessions for EPI Lab is that because they were remote, more students were coming to them than they were in person. They didn't have to come to campus. I also had shortened them. In the first year that I ran EPI Lab, the weekly sessions were 2 hours long. We would do things that were a bit more interactive, but this year they were just an hour long. So it was easier for students to attend to, and I actually got higher attendance during the pandemic than I did before. So to me, that's a success story, and it demonstrates that there's a long-term possibility there where if we make things available virtually, sometimes that's going to improve the engagement that we get from students because it means they don't have to come to campus and that sort of thing, even though the quality of interaction would be better in person. And one other thing I didn't get a chance to mention earlier, I put here MS Teams chat. So setting up those Teams workspaces for my applied class and saying, here, this is a place where you can talk to the people in your group and you can share documents and work on things together. Anecdotally, I get the sense that a lot of students are using that space or spaces like that space to stay in touch with each other in a way that they might not if that default connection hadn't been given to them. Again, I don't want to suggest that students aren't capable of connecting with each other or anything like that. Of course they are, and they'll use whatever platform makes sense. But I think when we give them these default spaces, it gives them more opportunities to connect with each other. And I just find when I talk to students about them staying in touch with their peers, I almost feel like I'm hearing more of that this year than I did in pre-pandemic times. So again, it's not like I have data or anything to prove that or any sort of statistical significance, but I think there are some successes there. So using crisis and innovating in crisis to deal with things can allow us to respond to some of the problems with that crisis. But the other success is that doing this, for me, like all of these feedback activities and implementing them and acting on them, it sort of doubles my focus on feedback in the future. So I know that when we go back to business as usual teaching, I'll be thinking about what we learned from this experience and thinking about the importance of feedback. Whenever we're rolling out a new program or changing something around, or the semester is just happening in a weird way, that's when you really especially need feedback. And I think EPI as a whole is going to be more focused on feedback coming out of the pandemic than it was before. My sort of caveat about this is that we need to be careful. You've probably read lots of articles about this during the pandemic. It's great if somebody develops a new skill or learns something new because of the pandemic, but we don't want to put pressure on anybody. I don't think we should be judging programs if they didn't innovate or didn't manage to improve, or if things really just were extremely difficult during the pandemic. That's totally normal. That's fine. We shouldn't judge people for that. But when it is an opportunity for innovation, it can be beneficial to grab that opportunity. The last point I want to make is about program level feedback, because sort of an underlying theme that you might have seen from this presentation is I'm not just talking about feedback in my own course. I'm talking about what we were able to do as a program to seek that feedback. And I think part of the reason that we're able to do that is because we're a small program. There's only the 4 core faculty. So doing something at a program level, it's a little easier to build consensus and to get consent to do that from everyone who's involved. And as you might have seen above, a lot of the most important changes came from doing that program level feedback and having the freedom to do that. And you would have noticed from the arrows in my table that some of the things we learned from the program level feedback applied to the individual courses. So the suggestion that I partner with locals for my applied problem solving course came from program level feedback, but then it really changed the way that I implemented that course. And then the idea of a virtual lobby also came from program level feedback, but these can be implemented in individual courses. So there's synergy with the course level feedback when you're able to do that. But of course, this is limited. Obviously, individual instructors have their own academic freedom, so we can't do program level feedback and then expect the program to tell an instructor to do something differently because of that. We can make suggestions, we can try to agree to things, and I have been quite encouraged by how often we go to implement one of these things and all of the instructors are on board. So when we tried to avoid scheduling assignments over the break, everyone who was teaching during that semester said, let's figure that out. That doesn't seem to be a problem. And earlier, I think I remember doing this for maybe my second year, but students had pointed out in my first year that a lot of the assignments in the different classes had come at the same time. So you'd have one due in one class and then one due in the next class. So we've made more of an effort since then to try to coordinate before finalizing the assignment schedule for each one. But I think in reality, sometimes it's difficult to get the spacing just right, and sometimes things do still create little bottlenecks, which are troublesome for students. But we have acted on that, and I've been really encouraged by the willingness of other faculty to look into those things. So those are my emerging lessons, what we can learn from the pandemic, what might be applicable to other programs, what EPI might try to do going forward. And I think even though it's been a struggle, and I think my presentation here might not be authentically communicating how much I know students were struggling with the pandemic during this year. I think there's a lot of positives to pull out of this and a lot that we can learn from this situation. So thanks very much.
Anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can type it into the chat.
I think I'll minimize the slideshow if I can figure out how to do that. There we go.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Your group work, you mentioned that your students were apprehensive about group work to start with. You did a check-in with them partway through. How did they feel about their group work at the end?
That's a great question. I think that there were some students who were apprehensive and then were pretty happy with how things worked out. They were happy with who they had been paired with. They were happy about how things had gone. And they generally felt that, they were able to achieve what they needed to. And I had facilitated what I needed to facilitate to make sure things weren't too tough. But then, of course, there were some students that weren't really that stressed out to begin with, and they didn't become stressed out by the group work. And then, of course, there were a couple of students who they were really hesitant about the group work, and even at the end, their sort of feedback or reflection on the group work was that it was extremely difficult for them to do. So some of those issues are difficult to address without completely changing what the course is meant to do. But I think I know this is sort of a counterfactual, but I do think that the effort to accommodate what students needed for that ended up leading to some successes and an overall more positive experience than it would have been.
As an instructional designer, I like to see group work because I think that it's one of those skills that students need to develop, because when they get out into the real world, they're going to be working in a group. Not very many careers out there, not very many professions have you working in isolation. And I think that the group work is really important. And what I'm hearing from some faculty is that students really hate it to start with, but with a little bit of coaching along the way, when they're done their project, they feel a sense of accomplishment, and they're glad that they had the opportunity to do the group work. But it does take a little bit of coaching and a little bit of interest with, not interest, interaction with the students.
Yeah, I do get the impression that with support, most students end up valuing the experience more than they thought they would, and sort of leaving it with a more positive impression than they would have predicted. But not all students, and you're right, the reason why we have it in that course is because it's sort of a practical course, and we want students to be able to get this skill set that they might not get in a sort of a standard course. But students have pointed out some important differences there. When you're working in a group in a university setting and somebody is sort of slacking off, there might not be much you can do, right? Like they might get a lower grade or something like that, but no one can make them do the work. Whereas in a work setting, it might be a little bit different, right? Like someone could get fired if they consistently do that. And it might be easier for your employer or your supervisor to see what's happening individually in terms of the group dynamic. And some of those discussions have led me to think that one of the things that I could do differently in future years is, so typically the way I do the group work is I say, I'm going to assign a group mark, but I'll adjust it individually. So if I always get the students to write these reflections after they finish the group work. So in those reflections, they'll say, here's what I did as part of the project, and here's what I thought about my teammates' work. So it'll usually become clear to me if somebody didn't do much work or if someone did a lot of extra work. So I'll make sort of individual adjustments. But I think what I'd like to do in the future is, instead of portraying it that way, that I start with the group mark and then adjust it, I think I'll say you're doing a group project, but each of you is going to end up with an individual mark. And they'll probably be close together. Like I'm going to start by thinking about what the paper's mark is. But I think by saying at the outset that I'm going to give individual marks, I think it'll give me a little bit more freedom to give individual students grades that I think they really deserve. And it might give students a little bit more accountability to think that they shouldn't necessarily rely on others to do the work. So I do have that thought going forward, and that's something that I didn't realize in time to implement this year, but I'd like to do in the future. See, there's a couple of things coming up in the chat, but they're just flashing by me, and then I don't see them. I think I can figure it out. Here we go.
Can you see them now?
Yes, I can. Yes, so that's a good question, Paige, about the formal course evaluations. And I can't really speak to this because, I didn't make the decision, right? This is sort of an administration decision to not conduct the CEQs. And yes, the reason is, if you're talking about somebody like me, say I end up with really negative CEQs during the pandemic. And part of the reason is because it's the pandemic and it's harder for students to have a good experience, and maybe it's harder for me to find the time and mental energy to put the same effort I usually would into courses. So it might not be representative, and that's why it's not included. But you're right. I do, basically one of the points that I'm making is that even though that's very understandable, and I know why we're doing that, it feels to me a little bit like the implication is, unless at the program or individual level, you decide that you're going to get your own feedback, the sort of message is we're just not getting feedback from students right now. We're just not going to collect at the individual course level. And I think you're right. I'm not sure that's properly balanced, but I suspect at the administrative level, this question is a little bit thornier. Even so, like I basically would agree with you. Like one of my position statements here is that we should find a way to make sure we're still getting feedback from students, even during the pandemic. And maybe you're also getting at the fact, like, what if you have a really bad experience with an instructor during the pandemic and it's just, bad on top of, it's worse on top of bad. And you want to be able to express that in a course evaluation questionnaire. It's true, there's not really an opportunity to do that. And I don't know the solution to that. Like even in normal times, no one is necessarily going to read the course evaluation questionnaire. If an instructor isn't interested in what you've said about their course, they don't have to read it. I think other students can access the feedback given on instructors. I think that's possible. So that's one person that might read it, but that's certainly not available at the time. So maybe you're right. Like maybe there's a nuanced solution to that somewhere in the middle, but I'm afraid I don't know what it is. My position for now is just, if we have the ability at the program or individual level to do it informally, we should do that. Even if it doesn't get put into somebody's promotion and tenure file or something like that, collecting the feedback is really important. Yes, Charlotte, different time zones and no access to shared campus. Well, I'm glad that it ended up being a valuable experience. I definitely caught that in a lot of the reflections, right? And most of the students who are posting here, by the way, are from some of these courses. I also have some students in the PhD program who also did reflections for group work. And some of them also mentioned this difficulty with time zones, especially since some of those students are still located internationally. So the time zone difference can be up to 10 hours or something like that. So that's really tricky. And I'm not sure I ever came up with a solution to that, other than to try to schedule the courses at times that would hopefully work for everybody. I don't know what the solution is at the individual group level, but I'm glad to hear that you're able to figure it out and that you see that as a valuable experience. And I suppose, as the world gets increasingly globalized and our collaborators start to be increasingly dispersed in different places, that is something that we want to get used to. Do we have to get more used to early morning meetings or evening meetings on occasion to accommodate somebody that's in a different time zone? Probably we do. So that's really interesting as well. Well, that's great to hear, Antoinette. I'm ashamed to admit that I wasn't able to catch much of the material before my own session in this conference. I did catch the tail end of the discussion for Kellyanne Butler's talk, but I missed the keynote this morning because I was finishing up marketing and I was preparing this presentation in sort of an ironic twist of fate. But I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear that. And gosh, I hope that's recorded because I'd really like to listen to the keynote and see if there's anything else I can put into my own practice.
I'm sure the keynote was recorded.
I'll find it.
Yeah, it'll be on the CITL YouTube channel.
Great. Will my talk also go on YouTube?
I believe so.
Hey, great. That's fine with me. And I guess this conversation about YouTube is going to be on YouTube as well, so it'll be really meta. I think we have
There you go.
5 more minutes. Yeah, right. I think we have about 5 more minutes if anyone else has a question or just a comment. Gosh, it doesn't have to be a question. I'm happy to hear discussion or just positions from others. And feedback is all about listening to disagreement. So if someone disagrees with something I've said here, I'd be very interested to hear that. Think about how to incorporate that into my own thinking.
I really like your allowing the students time at the end of class to mingle and discuss things like they would if they were in a real classroom. I often teach strictly asynchronous online, and I set up a discussion forum, and I call it the cafe, and I won't go in there, but it's a place for students to go and talk about whatever they want to talk about, and use it as their conversation like they would as they were leaving class. Some students take advantage of it and have a discussion, others don't. And that's just based on the feedback that they give me at the end of the course.
Yeah,
As an instructional designer, I encourage others to do that. And there's some hesitancy because they feel that negativity breeds negativity. And if one person has something negative to say, then they've got a whole class turned against them.
Well, I mean, really one of my favorite success story, even though it's just such a tiny thing, really it's the virtual lobby. It's just the one I like to talk about the most. And there's a profile of me for the CITL website, Teaching Tuesdays, where I talked about my use of tech in some of these classes. And I talked about the virtual lobby there. And I was just really excited to be able to share that. And it's just such an easy thing. So I'm in complete agreement about that and the importance of creating that. There's one more question from Paige, which I think we can get to before we are done. She's asking about asking for emotional labor when requesting that students put together the reflections. I think this is a really interesting perspective, Paige, because I'll admit that I haven't thought about the reflections from that angle before. Usually my perspective on the reflections is that I need to get some response from students to know how the group dynamics played out so that I can find out if there was a problem or something like that. But more importantly, there's, gosh, I wish I had a specific article about this or something like that, but I know that some of the common thinking around experiential learning is that it's not enough just to give students the opportunity to do something. You have to give them the opportunity to do and then reflect on that. And I think that's very true of my own learning and practice as well. So I've always thought of the reflections as, they're sort of a funny thing because I don't mark them, but I ask for them and I do read them and I use them. And I think my assumption, maybe this is a mistaken assumption, is that students benefit from that activity, that by reflecting on what they've learned, what they could do differently, what the challenges were, what their own strengths are, that they take a lot more out of the project than they would if they didn't reflect. And yeah, even though I'm asking them for that labor without giving them a grade or something specific in response, it wouldn't feel fair to grade them. So I think there's an interesting question there. Maybe there's still a nuance that's there for me to get, or an appreciation that I can communicate to students, and also make it clear to students that, you know, my expectations are not particularly high in terms of how much they put into the reflection. But if it were me, like when I'm reflecting, as opposed to like writing an academic paper, like I could just write like 5 pages. I could just stream of consciousness on the page. And maybe that's not true for everybody, but my expectations are different for the reflections than they would be for other papers. But there's probably more to be done in terms of communicating that in a fair way.
All right, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Garrett for his very interesting talk.